On August 10th, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was found dead, hanging in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Lower Manhattan, New York City. At the time, his death was ruled a suicide, and ostensibly, this looked like an open and shut case. A lifelong predator whose crimes had finally caught up with him decided to check out early instead of facing the world for the evil he'd done. But as more information came out, what from afar looked like a crystal clear situation was in reality a lot murkier than we thought. The public began asking some obvious questions like, how did Epstein manage to kill himself while on suicide watch at one of the highest security prisons in the world? Where did Epstein get the billions of dollars to fund such an opulent lifestyle? What was the nature of the elite connections? Was he connected to intelligence agencies, either foreign or domestic? Who actually was Jeffrey Epstein? Jeffrey Edward Epstein was born on January 20th, 1953 in New York City, New York. He grew up in Brooklyn on Coney Island as the elder brother of the middle-class Epstein family. Growing up, he attended Public School 188, Mark Twain Junior High School, and Lafayette High School, all in New York City. When Epstein was in school, he was known by peers as a sweet and generous but quiet nerd. He was by all means a bright and mostly normal young man. Classmates even gave the young, freckled, slightly overweight Epstein the nickname Epi as a sign of endearment. He graduated high school early, at the age of 16, and went on to attend both Cooper Union and NYU's Courant Institute, but didn't earn a degree from either, instead choosing to drop out in June of 1974. This is where things get weird, to put it mildly. Although Epstein was no doubt talented, he was also a college dropout with no degree, which is what makes his hiring at the elite preparatory Dalton School in September of 1974 all the more bizarre. For those who don't know, the Dalton School is one of the most expensive and elite preparatory schools in New York City, even classifying as a, quote, Ivy prep school. The school essentially functions like a pipeline to the global elite, with Dalton alumni sitting at some of the highest seats of power in places like Hollywood, news media, and finance. It's at this school that Epstein was hired to work, despite having no formal qualifications whatsoever. What's even weirder, though, is the man who hired him, Donald Barr, the Dalton headmaster and an officer in the OSS, the predecessor to the CIA, which was created by Franklin Roosevelt in World War II. In addition to being a headmaster and an OSS officer, Barr occasionally wrote pulp science fiction novels in his free time. In 1973, 1 year prior to hiring Epstein, Barr published a novel entitled Space Relations about a futuristic spacefaring society whose elites have developed a carnal desire to sexually abuse children. Keep in mind that this was written by the man who initially hired Jeffrey Epstein with no qualifications out of obscurity. If this wasn't odd enough, one of Donald Barr's sons, William Bill Barr, would go on to serve as the U.S. Attorney General under both George H.W. Bush and Donald Trump in his first term, meaning it was Donald Barr's son who oversaw the lax federal investigation into Jeffrey Epstein's alleged suicide. Epstein would go on to make myriad elite connections while at the Dalton School, both with students and their parents. In 1976, one of the parents recommended Epstein to Alan Greenberg, a senior partner at Bear Stearns, one of the biggest American investment firms, before it failed during the Great Recession. This worked out timely for Epstein, who would be fired from the Dalton School later that same year for, quote, poor performance. But this is a specious euphemism. In reality, Epstein had been violating teacher norms in his entire time at Dalton, with students later recalling that Epstein was notorious for inappropriate attention towards female students. Epstein apparently even attended a Dalton School party where alcohol was present, something no other Dalton teacher ever did. Remember also that this was the 1970s, and Epstein was already a man of significant power and influence. If the school had disclosed the true nature of his firing, it would reflect poorly, and everyone in Dalton's elite web would take notice. Instead, they allegedly opted for a more bureaucratic, respectable reason, which they attributed for his firing. Poor performance. Epstein left Dalton in '76 and went straight into Bear Stearns for an interview where he impressed Alan Greenberg, his referral and the man who would go on to become the CEO of Bear Stearns just 2 years later in 1978. Greenberg reportedly did not tend to hire men from aristocratic backgrounds, instead opting to hire modest men with a deep desire to become rich. After being hired at Bear Stearns by Greenberg, Epstein began his work as a low-level junior assistant to a floor trader where he reportedly excelled. However, in late 1976, Bear Stearns discovered that the 2 degrees which Epstein had provided them on his resume were fake. Shockingly, though, instead of firing Epstein on the spot, Bear Stearns decided to keep him on. Epstein continued working at Bear Stearns, rapidly ascending up the corporate ladder while doing so. During this time, Epstein apparently bought one of his girlfriends nearly $10,000 in jewelry and charged it all to the Bear Stearns company card. He was never reprimanded. By the early 1980s, Epstein was one of the most prolific employees at Bear Stearns, meeting new members of the global elite every day. Epstein was on top of the world, both literally in his Bear Stearns skyscraper office and metaphorically in the connections he was making with elites. But trouble would arrive for Epstein when, in mid-1981, Bear Stearns suspended Epstein after he gave out a $15,000 loan to a former classmate that breached federal laws. Instead of waiting out the suspension, Epstein denied all wrongdoing and quit on the spot. If up until this point, the people Epstein had been mingling and connecting with were considered the global elite, then that would make the people he began to converse and connect with in the 1980s the elite of the elite. These were people at the top of the global power hierarchy, operating internationally, yet in the shadows, at the highest levels of realpolitik. Many of these people were involved in the labyrinthine network of arms trafficking around the world. Epstein would meet and work with figures like British arms dealer Douglas Leese, Saudi arms trafficker Adnan Khashoggi, and American lawyer John Stanley Pottinger, who is known for his defense of extremely wealthy clients, specifically arms traffickers. Many of these connections Epstein facilitated through International Assets Group, IAG, a financial advisory company he formed in August 1981. What's interesting about the arms traffickers he connected with was their proximity to not just black market arms deals, but also to intelligence agencies. All 3 of the men I named just a moment ago were involved to various degrees in the Iran-Contra affair, an intelligence operation run by the CIA in conjunction with several other countries, which created a pipeline of weapons being sent to Iran in exchange for money and more weapons being sent to Nicaragua to fund anti-communist rebels. John Stanley Pottinger served as a clandestine advisor to the Iranians. Adnan Khashoggi served as the middleman between the various Iran-Contra parties. And Douglas Leese facilitated the sale of weapons from Chinese arms manufacturer Norinco to Iran during the affair. And all of them were meaningfully connected to Epstein. However, what is most damning is Epstein's own alleged connection to the Iran-Contra affair. The planes which flew the money and guns around the world fueling the Iran-Contra affair belonged to a company called Southern Air Transport, located in Miami, Florida. Southern Air Transport was initially owned by the CIA before they relinquished ownership in the 1970s. Nevertheless, despite Southern Air Transport technically being privately owned at this point, the CIA continued to use it as a shell company throughout the remainder of the Cold War, flying guns and money around the world to places as distant as Angola, Vietnam, and Nicaragua. Although Southern Air Transport had been a pretty foolproof mechanism for accomplishing clandestine geopolitical strategies, its fallibility would show in 1985 when a Southern Air Transport plane was shot down above Nicaragua and the details of the Iran-Contra affair were soon revealed to the public. After this key event, scrutiny was drawn over Southern Air Transport and The CIA had to pull away from using it. However, just a few years later, in 1995, Southern Air Transport announced its relocation from Miami, Florida to Columbus, Ohio. According to DropSite News, who sourced this claim from veteran Columbus journalist Bob Fitrakis, Jeffrey Epstein was a key figure, if not the key figure, involved in the facilitation of this move. The ostensible purpose for the move was to foster economic growth by serving some of the largest corporations in Columbus, the largest of which was Victoria's Secret, a women's underwear and lingerie company ran by the enigmatic businessman Les Wexner. Wexner was one of the 422 billionaires in the world at the time, and he was also Epstein's prime client. Indeed, Epstein's financial advice was so crucial to Wexner that he gave him power of attorney over all his assets. Just to put this into perspective, the power of attorney gave Epstein the ability to sell Wexner's real estate, access his bank accounts, and sign contracts on his behalf. I want you to imagine for a second the mindset of Les Wexner. He's a billionaire tycoon whose life's work has been dedicated to turning his company into a global business empire. Why would someone as self-reliant and self-obsessed as Wexner give Jeffrey Epstein, a college dropout, power of attorney over his Fortune 500 company and all of his assets, which he'd spent his entire life acquiring? It's worth noting that in 2020, Wexner did eventually claim that he had been defrauded by Epstein, around the tune of $46 million, and that he'd cut ties with Epstein over the fraud in 2007. But when you apply just an ounce of critical scrutiny towards one of the pieces in Wexner's story, his entire Jenga tower of lies falls to the ground. For one, how could a businessman who is so economically minded, who has built a global business that spans continents, be so careless as to allow $46 million to be defrauded from him? Furthermore, if they'd cut ties in 2007, why did he wait till 2020 to speak up? And finally, why would a billionaire give total power to someone so unqualified who would never be trusted with it by anyone of a comparable net worth? Either Les Wexner is the most incompetent billionaire ever, which is itself an oxymoron, incompetent billionaire, or he and Epstein were part of something much bigger and much more sinister than fraud. It's worth mentioning that around this time, Epstein was introduced to his sadistic partner in crime, Ghislaine Maxwell, a British socialite who would associate with Epstein until the very end. Most sources and testimony say that Epstein and Ghislaine met in the early 1990s. However, a select few say that in reality they met a few years earlier, in the late 1980s, and that the man who introduced them to each other was Ghislaine's father, Robert Maxwell. Whether this is true or not, it's undeniable that Ghislaine was very close with both her father and Epstein, and it's difficult to imagine that the two would never cross paths considering their proximity to her. Robert Maxwell was the Citizen Kane, or William Randolph Hearst, of the United Kingdom. He was both a Labour member of Parliament for a period of time and a billionaire newspaper magnate. Maxwell was Trumpian in his aesthetics, living a lavish life of luxury, bankrolled by his corporate success. At the height of his power and influence, Maxwell owned 2 of the 10 most popular UK newspapers, the Daily Mirror and the Sunday Mirror, which reportedly reached 1 in 3 British adults every week. During the Cold War, Maxwell had repeated contact and worked with both MI6 and KGB officials. So much so that eventually both sides suspected him of being compromised by the other. Things would take a bizarre turn during the British economic recession of the early 1990s when Maxwell's companies reached a breaking point. He'd been using lenders and investors to keep his corporate endeavors and opulent personal life afloat, even when his businesses were losing money. By late 1991, many investors were pulling out, which put intense financial and regulatory pressure on Maxwell. He was frantic and didn't know what to do. Then, in November 1991, Maxwell skipped a meeting with the Bank of England about his bankrupt companies in favor of boarding his massive yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, and taking it to the Canary Islands, off the coast of Africa. Over the phone, Maxwell's son Kevin had an argument with his father over the decision to abscond from the country in such a way. Maxwell ended the call angrily and disappeared into the passages of his super yacht, only for him to be found dead the next day, floating in the ocean. Besides a graze on the left shoulder, Maxwell had no wounds or signs of blunt force on his body, and the official ruling declared that he had fallen off of his yacht while urinating into the ocean at night. However, skepticism was still drawn. This was intensified by Maxwell's posthumous financial records, which showed that during his business's trying times, he illegally stole hundreds of millions of pounds from his employees' pension fund and used it to prop up not just his businesses, but also his decadent personal life. However, things would become even more bizarre when Maxwell's body was shipped not to the UK, where he was a citizen, and not even to Czechoslovakia, where he was born. Maxwell's body was shipped to Israel, of all places, where he was buried in the Mount of Olives Cemetery, the holiest cemetery in all of Israel. And during his funeral, none other than Yitzhak Shamir, the prime minister of Israel at the time, performed a personal eulogy in which he stated about Maxwell, "He has done more for Israel than can be said today." Indeed, the KGB and MI6 were not the only intelligence agencies which Maxwell collaborated with. Former Israeli spy and whistleblower Ari Ben-Menashe, who has made myriad bombshell allegations, some with more credibility than others, about clandestine geopolitics, which each deserve videos of their own. He stated about Robert Maxwell that he was not a double agent working for the KGB or MI6, but a secret committed agent of the Mossad, who used his connections to British and Soviet intelligence agencies to play both sides off the Cold War against each other for the benefit of Mossad and Israel. Ben-Menashe has also claimed that none other than Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell were also assets of the Mossad, who collected blackmail on the most elite and powerful people in the West for the benefit of Israel. That, on its face, is a shocking claim, but the more one looks at the notion of Epstein as a Mossad blackmailer, the less it looks like a salacious headline, and the more it looks like a disturbing fact. Blackmail is defined in Merriam-Webster's dictionary as extortion or coercion by threats, especially of public exposure or criminal prosecution. Epstein circulated through the highest levels of finance and geopolitics, two worlds which share a nature of hierarchical ruthlessness. From J. Edgar Hoover to James Goldsmith, both worlds have a documented history of blackmail functioning as a mechanism of power within. From this observation, we can deduce that the idea that Epstein would engage in such a crime as blackmail is a lot less far-fetched than it initially sounded. But what kind of blackmail would Epstein want on people? Well, a vast amount of people, ranging from victims to ex-spies, have claimed that the young girls which Epstein procured were not just for his own sick pleasure. They also functioned as a honey trap to lure in predatory elites. Epstein would then record their crimes with surveillance cameras hidden all throughout the house and use the footage as blackmail. This notion is seemingly supported by the FBI's own account of Epstein's property from their 2019 raid of his New York City townhouse, in which they described finding a safe containing a fake Saudi passport from the 1980s depicting Epstein, hundreds of photographs of nude women, and a collection of discs, each topped off with a handwritten label containing names and descriptions. Some of the names belonged to the victims, others didn't, leading many observers to lend credence to the blackmail hypothesis. However, if one wants proof that Epstein was a blackmailer, you don't even need to look too far. You could get it right from the horse's mouth, in fact. In October of 2025, Secretary of Commerce and former neighbor to Jeffrey Epstein, Howard Lutnick, went on the New York Post's Pod Force One podcast to discuss the nature of Epstein's elite connections.
So how come Bill Gates and all these other people could hang around him and not see what you saw? Or did they see it and ignore it? Or
No, they participated.
right.
That's what his MO was, get a massage, get a massage. And what happened in that massage room, I assume was on video. This guy was the greatest blackmailer ever. Blackmailed people. That's how he had money.
Lutnick then went on to describe Epstein introducing himself to him after moving in and taking him and his wife on a tour of his neighboring townhouse. Lutnick went on to say that during the tour, Epstein showed them a candlelit room with a massage table in the center.
So he gives me a tour in the living room, big living room. And then across from it is double doors. I assume it's the dining room.
Yeah.
And he opens the doors and there's a massage table in the middle
Ooh.
of the room.
Ooh.
and candles all around and stuff. So I ask very insightful, cutting questions. I say to him, massage table in the middle of your house? How often you have a massage? And he says, every day. And then he gets weirdly close to me.
Ooh.
And he says, and the right kind of massage.
Ooh.
Now my wife is standing here. So she looks at me and I look at her and we say, I'm sorry, we have to go. And we left. And in the 6 or 8 steps it takes to get from his house to my house, my wife and I decided that I will never be in the room with that disgusting person ever again.
Lutnick would immediately take back the blackmail comments after the podcast's release, claiming that he was only speculating and, quote, didn't have any basis to say it in fact. Stark departure from his confident tone in the podcast, I know, but I digress. Unfortunately, Lutnick's soliloquy detailing his rejection of Jeffrey Epstein's acquaintanceship on principle would be put into question when in January 2026, as part of an Epstein files dump, the U.S. Department of Justice released photos of Lutnick on Epstein's private island, Little St. James. What's worse is that emails from that same dump show Lutnick attempting to coordinate a visit to said island with his children. These aren't the only communications between Epstein and Lutnick. The files show that the two stayed in contact up until at least 2017, nearly a decade after Epstein had been registered as a sex offender. Hearing that detail will shock you, I know. It certainly shocked me. But in order to understand the criminality and injustice of this specific part of the case, one has to turn to the final chapter of Epstein's life. In July of 2006, Epstein was arrested at his residence in Palm Beach, Florida, after a months-long investigation by the Palm Beach police initiated by tips they had received, specifically one from a mother who alleged her 14-year-old stepdaughter was lured to the mansion by an older girl where she was paid $300 to strip down to her underwear and give Epstein a massage. Despite the police having an alarming number of victims who would testify against Epstein, he was only charged with 1 count of solicitation of prostitution by the grand jury. The local police were outraged, especially when Epstein was released on bond the same day he was arrested. So they escalated the case to the FBI, who began their own investigation into Epstein later that same year. However, the FBI's federal investigation proved to be short-lived after the U.S. Attorney for South Florida, Alexander Acosta, crafted a plea deal for Epstein, which he eagerly took. Retrospectively, this has been referred to as Epstein's sweetheart deal because of how lax the punishment was. In spite of the large amount of evidence the FBI was able to gather in its narrow window, no federal charges would be brought against Epstein. The deal also entailed an abnormally low 18-month prison sentence, of which he would only serve 13, and an extensive work release program, which allowed Epstein to leave the prison for up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The only bitter pill, which Epstein would be forced to swallow, was his registration as a sex offender in 2008. However, this didn't stop Epstein, who completed his prison sentence in 2009 and immediately continued with business as usual. Of course, business as usual for Epstein meant meeting with arms dealers, financiers, and heads of state. In the 10 years between his initial release and second arrest, while registered as a sex offender, mind you, Epstein would meet with Peter Thiel, the co-founder and chairman of Palantir, Ehud Barak, the former prime minister of Israel, and Elon Musk, now the richest man in the world, and the founder of Tesla and SpaceX. Epstein maintained his large empire throughout the final decade of his life. It was only in 2018 when the Miami Herald published Julie K. Brown's Perversion of Justice, a piece which went into detail about Epstein's 2008 sweetheart deal, that public interest was reinvigorated and federal officials reopened the case against Epstein. Federal officials working with the Crimes Against Children Task Force arrested Epstein at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey in July 2019. As the public eye shifted its gaze back onto Epstein's initial arrest and subsequent sweetheart deal, intense scrutiny was drawn towards the architect of that deal, Alexander Acosta, who is now the 27th Secretary of Labor in the first administration of Donald Trump, the same administration as Bill Barr. During the heat of Epstein hysteria, the Daily Beast published a quote from an unnamed Trump administration official who claimed that when Acosta was asked about Epstein during his interview with the Trump transition team, he claimed that the reason he gave Epstein such an abnormally lenient sweetheart deal was because he was told that, and I quote, Epstein belonged to intelligence and that he should leave it alone, end quote. Shortly after these comments came out, Acosta resigned as Secretary of Labor. Epstein was placed in the Manhattan Correctional Center, one of the highest security prisons in the world, which has housed inmates like Bernie Madoff, Sam Bankman-Fried, and El Chapo. Unfortunately for Epstein, though, the MCC would end up being his tomb. On August 10th, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell from an apparent suicide by hanging. All the cameras pointed at him went out, both of the guards tasked with checking on him were asleep, and the entire world collectively called BS. The esoteric refers to knowledge that is hidden from the world and only made available to a select special few. Though it can refer to purely material secret knowledge, it is often used to imply hidden knowledge related to mysticism or the occult. So what does this have to do with Jeffrey Epstein? Well, more than you would think prima facie. Amongst a trove of thousands of emails from Epstein's Yahoo account obtained by Bloomberg are a series of Amazon receipts showing Jeffrey Epstein had purchased books like Modern Sex Magic, Secrets of Erotic Spirituality, Secrets of Western Tantra, The Sexuality of the Middle Path, and A Chakra and Kundalini Workbook, Psychospiritual Techniques for Health, Rejuvenation, Psychic Powers, and Spiritual Rejuvenation. These books featured heuristics and rituals for channeling sexual energy from the doctrine of occultist Aleister Crowley's Thelema and the Jewish Kabbalah, among many others. Although most would dismiss buying books like this as being typical of a rich and sex-crazed predator pervert, their occult subject matter is very real. Although to us, Epstein seems like someone unique in the nature and depravity of his evil, this couldn't be further from the truth. Scattered throughout the pages of history are instances where the elite members of great, powerful civilizations secretly engage in wicked and ritualistic abuse. After the death of Octavian, the Roman Emperor Tiberius took over and continued many of his successful policies, such as fiscal responsibility, border stability, and provincial loyalty. However, as time passed, Tiberius withdrew more and more from public life, entrusting many of his duties to Sejanus, the head of the elite Roman Praetorian Guard, who ruled like a tyrant for years before Tiberius finally had him executed in 31 AD. Faced with a skeptical Roman Senate and populace, Tiberius retreated onto the island of Capri, where he continued to govern. Rumors began to spread amongst the Roman people that Tiberius was secretly engaging in acts of sadistic hedonism in his exile. Allegations of ritualistic CSA, torture, and executions for his own pleasure permeated the Roman psyche. Tiberius went down in history as an effective but monstrous and sybaritic emperor who let his own hedonistic self-indulgence lead him to the ends of the earth, where he died. Gilles de Rais was a French nobleman and knight who was famous for his service for France in the 100 Years' War against England. During the war, de Rais fought valiantly in an array of battles, even fighting alongside the likes of Joan of Arc at the battles of Orleans, Jargeau, and Patay. After the war, de Rais was lauded as a war hero by the French, who gave him the title Marshal of France. He retired to his picturesque chateau in the country and began enjoying the spoils of his power. De Rais spent exorbitant amounts of money on decadence, including everything from a private militia to a blockbuster theatrical play about his own military adventures. However, as time passed, de Rais's spending got so intense it drove him to near bankruptcy. In his state of desperation, he turned to the occult and hired a Tuscan alchemist named Francois Prelati to attempt to summon a demon at his isolated estate. Dries believed he could use supernatural means to recover his wealth, but after 3 attempts at a ritual, no demon manifested. In his pressure-filled, despondent state, Dries asked Prelati what could be done to summon the demon, to which he told him that the demon was angry and requested the body of a child. Over the past couple of years, hundreds of young children disappeared from the village surrounding Dries' castle. Whispers soon arose amongst the townspeople that Dries had been the one kidnapping them. Indeed, this morbid theory would unfortunately be proven correct, as Dries had been using the promise of food and water to lure the children into his towering castle. Dries provided Prelati with the corpse of one of his hundreds of victims, and he went ahead with the ritual, but to no avail. The demon didn't manifest, and Dries continued his losing streak, still unpunished by the law. Only after a land dispute later that year, in which Dries violently seized back a piece of his land with a church on it, did the authorities step in and detain him. During his trial, Dries' servants confessed everything, causing the court to condemn Dries. Dries was hanged in the public square. England in the 18th century was a changing place. No longer were the British Isles a medieval, puritanical society. The Enlightenment dominated British intellectual life, and the Industrial Revolution began to slowly produce a small middle class, where there had only been the extreme rich and extreme poor before. It's during this time that Sir Francis Dashwood, a British member of Parliament from New Romney, created his own secret society for the rich and powerful, which held clandestine meetings featuring prostitutes, alcohol, and rituals mocking the Christian church, where the members would honor gods like Bacchus, Venus, and Daphne. Dashwood's club would earn many names over the course of its existence: the Order of the Knights of St. Francis, the Order of the Knights of West Wycombe. However, the most famous name for Dashwood's club would appear later: the Hellfire Club. This name was used to describe several secret British clubs of the 18th century, but nowhere was it more accurate than at Dashwood's club. They met in Medmenham Abbey, a large estate in the country bordering the edge of the River Thames, and in the Hellfire Caves, a series of long, labyrinthine tunnels commissioned by Dashwood out in the rural West Wycombe. Dashwood told the public that he commissioned the caves to give work to the local agrarian workforce, suffering a famine at the time. They dug the tunnels entirely by hand, not knowing the licentiousness which they would be used for. At the height of its membership, the Hellfire Club included national politicians, writers, and Oxford professors. Even the American founding father, Benjamin Franklin, is alleged to have attended at one point. The elite debauchery at the Hellfire Club was kept a secret for the entirety of its existence, until one John Wilkes, a former member of the club who had been kicked out, decided to leak the information about the club to the news. As little bits of information were released, the politically influential members of the club began to sweat. Paul Whitehead, a poet and the secretary of the Hellfire Club, ordered all records to be set aflame 3 days before he died, leaving what actually happened in the Hellfire Club to the realm of myth and mystery. All of these cases share the same disturbing similarity: civilizational elites taking pleasure from secretly engaging in acts of transgression. No matter the time or place, whether in ancient Rome, medieval France, or contemporary America, this archetype manifests. Indeed, the most eerie part about the entire Epstein case, when viewed with the proper historical context, is that Epstein was not an anomaly, but the rule. Epstein's operation wasn't run by one man. It needed cars, planes, money, mansions, and ultimately a state prosecutor who bent the knee to Epstein's will. The entire operation was at least enabled, if not directly propped up, by the most powerful interests in our society: governments, finance, and intelligence agencies. On August 10th, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell at the most secure prison in America. Every camera pointed at him went dark. Both guards assigned to check on him were asleep. Whether he died by his own hand or someone else's, the people who had protected him for decades got exactly what they needed: his permanent silence. What is the esoteric knowledge in the Epstein files? It is the blueprint of the infrastructure of hidden power which runs our world, and it's been there in plain sight this entire time. Hi. If you made it to the end of the video, I just want to say thank you. This took a lot of work, all the writing, filming, and editing. But if I'm being real, the most difficult part of this video was actually the subject matter. I mean, this is some really disturbing stuff, the Epstein case. But unfortunately, it needs to be understood because of how relevant it is to our world and our politics. So I hope you all were able to get something out of this video. I certainly got something out of it while I was writing it. If you like the video, then please like and subscribe. That feels weird saying that on this Epstein video, but I'm going to post some more content related to this and kind of in the same vein in the future. So if you're interested in that, please subscribe and like the video. And until then, I'm Andrew White, and this is the Esoteric Knowledge in the Epstein Files.